Fascinating, wasn't it? I'm going to introduce our panel in a second. I see a lot of people making notes on that, probably for applications, grant applications, financial applications in the future. Before I introduce our panel, could I ask you one question, Meric? I think you're right. You're singing to the choir here. Absolutely. Why do you think people in government and policymakers often don't get the arguments you've just made?
It's a complicated answer. I think that one of the problems has been that they tend to first appreciate universities as cost centers rather than as investments. And I think one has to work very hard and consistently to change their mindset on that front. I think it's what Patrick and I do for much of our jobs. We convince and make the case to those who control the purse strings that expenditures in our sector are actually investments in the future.
If you could see the benefits within one political mandate, they might get it more quickly, right?
Well, let me give you a story, an example recently. So I mentioned Thomson Reuters as a global firm, nominally Canadian, but it did not have much of a Canadian presence. And about 5 or 6 months ago, they announced that they were creating a new research center, a global research center in Toronto with about 1,000 knowledge workers coming to Toronto eventually. They were attracted not by tax incentives. In fact, there was no government investment at all. There were no either grants or regulatory changes. What attracted them was the talent, was the quality of the research being done at institutions like the University of Toronto. And our government partners, particularly at the province of Ontario, were really struck by that. They also worked with the federal government to ensure that there were as few hurdles as possible when it comes to the company being able to move talent into Canada from outside. So immigration and visa issues were another key area. But there was no money required to bring them there. Instead, it was just a really clear demonstration of the power of really smart people, great institutions, and the work that's being done to draw that kind of inward investment to the city. And so those kinds of stories are ones that we retell as frequently as possible in order to make the point.
Oh, let me introduce our other guest joining us on the stage. Next to Meric is Professor Bjorn Asheim, who's Professor of Economic Geography and Innovation Studies at the University of Stavanger in Norway. I hear it's a pretty oil-rich time. Whether it's an oil-rich university, we'll find out perhaps in a minute. Dr. Linda Fox-Rogers, Lecturer in Spatial Planning at Queen's University. Professor Kevin Morgan, Professor of Governance and Development at Cardiff University. Dr. Joanne Stewart, Director of Development at Catalyst Inc., and Suzanne Wiley, Chief Executive of Belfast City Council. Can we welcome them, make them feel at home on our panel? Good to see you. All right. So very simple, we're going to talk for a little bit and then we'll bring you into the conversation. Make a point, agree, disagree, push back a little bit. Bjorn, what are your first thoughts?
So, let me follow up with Meric in an attempt to answer your very important question. I think one key factor here is the need for leadership. Leadership in university, leadership in the public sector, leadership in industry. You need strategic leadership. You need to make universities relevant, and that requires some sort of adaptation in the form of organizational and institutional changes to take up these challenges and to make industry or to make public sector see the relevance of it. So let me take these societal challenges, Most of those are interdisciplinary in character. So in order for university to contribute to that, in order also to really benefit from the increasing amount of public funding that is directed to solving this problem, the university need to undergo some changes. You have to look at is the old structure with faculty and department, is that the right one, optimal one, or do you need what we call Mode 2, more interdisciplinary, more problem-oriented, more application-oriented, where also the stakeholders take part in deciding what is relevant research. This doesn't mean applied research, it can be basic, but it's a different way of thinking as one example. Secondly, I think that if you've got this in place, I think it's important with some major societal and institutional sort of, I call it organizational and institutional innovations. So based on my Swedish experiences, I've been working many years in Sweden too, I think it's very important that the third mission, it becomes an explicit part of the regulatory framework of universities, which means that you move the responsibility from the individual level, academic, to an institutional level. That in Sweden have had that for many, many years, turned out as very important. Secondly, I think it's important that the university's third mission activities are aligned with regional innovation and national innovation policy. It could be in the framework of smart specialization, for instance, so you sort of can contribute to what the innovation policy aims to solve. And thirdly, then, I think it's important also with the funding system. So you back this up through changing the funding system. So you boost interdisciplinary research, for instance, more than disciplinary research. This is also taking place in Sweden, and that helps sort of promoting the changes I talk about, which will make universities more relevant for other stakeholders in society.
Let's pick up on that, Meric, on the role of leadership. I don't want to stereotype your lecture as if you're simply suggesting create a research-intensive university, stick it in any deprived region, and you'll see a flourishing of the economy and creativity and everything else. But leadership, inspiring leadership, seems to be significant, Bjorn saying, and a certain kind of leadership. What do we understand about the kinds of leadership in research-intensive institutions that are effective?
Well, I think that I'd mention first and foremost, the importance of inspiring members of your community inside a university to engage in activity that crosses the boundary of that university. It could be collaborative research with partners outside in private sector, in public sector, in third sector. It could be volunteer activity. It could be finding ways for students to engage in learning by doing.
So knock down the walls between these departments and
making
schools.
that wall as permeable and as porous as possible. For me, that is the most important thing. I actually work at an institution whose main campus was perhaps better known for being more of a fortress than a place that was embracing its role as a city-building institution. But it's remarkable how quickly that has changed once we started talking about it and inspiring people to engage in that kind of activity.
Linda, give us your thoughts.
Well, as you rightly said, I think you are already preaching to the converted here, and I think you've certainly made your point. On only this morning I was in Dublin at a meeting of the Irish Planning Institute, and we were developing our submission on the National Planning Framework for the Republic of Ireland. And in trying to identify suitable cities to try to rebalance economic development in Ireland, one of the key criteria that came up for discussion was we should be picking cities or targeting cities with a higher education institution. So I think a lot of the points that you're raising today are very relevant. I suppose in thinking about the future role of the university though, and it's something that you've already touched on actually, is to what extent can we continue to see universities play a really proactive role in light of the pressures facing the higher education sector, such as the privatisation of education, pressures and the emphasis on commercialisation, and to what extent can we continue to see the university play that role? And not only that, but also perhaps look at the potential of the university to play that broader social role, some of the initiatives that you already highlighted today, and maybe delivering an education system for intellectual inquiry that's not just specifically geared towards specific economic interests. So I'm interested to see maybe what direction.
Are you hinting at education for its own sake?
Not necessarily.
I know we're not allowed to say that kind of thing anymore in the history of education. We've moved on, haven't we? But there is a role for education for its own sake.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think there's a role for education, not just for economic development and prosperity and upskilling students for employment, but there's also a role for education for intellectual inquiry in a broader sense as well.
to shape a human life.
Yes, yeah.
What's wrong with that idea? and sometimes you get academics in universities all around the world, Meric, pushing back on this economic model of almost justification for universities, and suggesting, it's okay if you're working in green chemistry or something like that, but what if you're working in philosophy or in classics or in a language discipline or something like that?
Yeah. Well, I'm amazed by how colleagues across the entire university have really embraced this idea of transforming our university into a city-building entity and are keen to contribute. I recently had lunch with a professor of English who was telling me all about the work that she's been doing on cities and how she wants to contribute to a new cross-university initiative on cities. So, it's not limited to the professions that one would expect. I think that, just in sort of picking up on your comment, given the increasing pressures that universities and higher education in general find themselves under these days, it's all the more important that we demonstrate the ways in which we create value for the host societies in which we are situated. And we can do that in a variety of ways, including, of course, creating opportunities for our students while they are studying to engage in experiential learning, which has the added benefit, of course, of doing good in the community around us. So those are some of the things that we are talking up as a way of helping to make the case to those who do indeed make financial decisions about why investing in our sector is actually a sensible thing to do.
Sometimes when please, Bjorn, don't let me dominate things.
So I think it's a very important point that you raised there. And my experience is that you need to have a balanced funding system. You need to have a solid public funding base to be able to sort of do third mission in the broad sense that Meric talks about. So not only this more narrow thing with sort of commercialization, but do more to work with broader stakeholders, or what John Goddard, previous Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Newcastle University, called the engaged university. That's also part of sort of third mission. And then you have disciplines like fundamental art disciplines that have an even bigger task to keep societies civilized, which is not sort of directly mounting out in creating jobs and things like that. So they have this broad thing. But if you're too dependent of external funding university, you can't take on this. And then the university loses a very important function. But giving a balanced funding system, I think it's possible to have these two thoughts in your head at the same time.
It's possible to have two thoughts in your head at the same time. Thank you very much. Kevin.
Meric outlined three major attributes of what you might call the engaged university, and I thought his arguments were very robust. But I think there's a fourth attribute as well, which we sometimes don't acknowledge, and because we don't acknowledge, we don't validate it, and that is what you might call the convening power of a university as a place-based institution to act as a safe space where its partners in business, government, civil society can collaborate to do whatever is locally prioritized. But collaboration, Meric spoke about U of T and Queen's, they've got very, very good track records. They are best practice in many ways. But on the whole, our sector leaves a lot to be desired, if we're being frank about this, in terms of our external collaboration. And there are challenges and opportunities. On the challenges, I would say that our procedures, our structures, our strategies are way, way too slow and too bureaucratic to satisfy the pace of innovation or the scale of social need. So I would say that on the challenges, that's the big one, to become fitter for the future, if you will. But on the other hand, there are opportunities as well. I mean, in terms of the metrics by which all academics are judged now in the United Kingdom, there's a chink of light in the sense that we now have an impact metric where all academics have to demonstrate.
Have we worked out what it means yet?
Well, we can talk about that, but I know academics feel overly audited, and I sympathise with that. But I've never met an academic in my life who's indifferent to the impact of her or his work. So the metrics are changing. There's a chink of light to be more engaged, to validate that kind of external engagement. And as I say, there's a deep appetite, as Meric showed in his staff. There's a deep appetite in all scholars, I think, to want to engage in societal challenges. So it's addressing those, it's being frank about the problems in our sector, on the one hand, addressing the challenges, being fitter for the future, and then tapping that natural energy that's in the academy to engage to good social effect.
Say a little bit more for us about where you think those challenges originate. How do you explain that lack of engagement that you sometimes
for my sins, I'm Dean of Engagement at Cardiff University.
Well, you would say that, of course.
For half the week, I work for the Vice-Chancellor on our engagement with business, government, and civil society organisations. I used to just research it in the past, but doing it shows me the incredible time-consuming tasks of aligning our interests as an institution with, let's say, the city. Even where there's goodwill on the part of the city and the university, and that's not always the case, of course, but in our case, there's goodwill, but even in the context of goodwill, it's incredibly difficult to align our goals, our interests, our mindsets, to work together, to collaborate. So collaboration is the way forward, and it needs to be more iterative, not that horrible phrase of technology transfer, where the university imparted its knowledge in a one-way street to its beneficiaries. It's now much more iterative, and the academy, I'd say the biggest challenge of all, is for academics to recognise the knowledges that lie outside the academy, whether it's in business, in civil society, or in government. There's a lot of knowledge outside the academy, but academics have not had a good track record about respecting it. And you can't have a good partnership unless you respect your partner.
That's a perfect segue to Joanne, because you're all about partnerships, knowledge partnerships.
No, absolutely, and collaboration was one of the key points that I brought out of that lecture. Obviously, at Catalyst Inc, we're focused very much on growing the knowledge economy. The sectors that are part of that economy are very research intensive, and we are very fortunate that we have Queen's and we have Ulster, who are both very successful in research. But we need to have more world-class research institutes that are fully integrated with industry. We have a great example with ESET and CSET that are co-located on the Catalyst Inc campus down at Titanic. And what that has shown is that it's this relevance we talked about, and that research institute is world-class. It's attracting talent from across the globe, and as well as having its own spin-outs from the research that's being developed, it's also linking very closely with industry. And actually, if you look at a number of companies at Catalyst Inc, the alumni from ESET you will find in senior positions in those companies. So it starts to create that culture and that cluster, of organisations. But we need more of those type of institutes. The other thing is, because as we talk about funding. Industry are very happy to see this inclusion of impact when it comes to funding for research, because funding or increasing investment in science and engineering research does not necessarily have an impact on the economy. It's the integration of that with industry. And actually, it was Sir John McCanney, who's in the audience tonight. I was doing an event with him earlier this week, and we were talking about this, and what he'd said, research really is about, and I'm paraphrasing John, but research is really the translation of lots of money, lots of investment into a small number of ideas. But innovation is taking a small number of ideas and translating that into a lot of money. And it's that integration with the innovation ecosystem that is so important.
Successful companies, of course, get this. Innovation is not a choice.
No, absolutely. And somebody talked about the pace of change.
Do we have something at the policy-making level in the different spheres of government here? Do we have anything approaching a strategy for innovation?
Yes. We do. What I will say is that we've been working on the UK industrial strategy, and I would say that has definitely really focused in on how do you integrate, really, how do you support science, technology and innovation.
What about the Northern Ireland industrial strategy?
Yes, the Northern Ireland is and there is about innovation. It recognises that we need to get more companies innovating, and with the profile of the companies in Northern Ireland, we have a lot of SMEs, and I think it's traditionally has been quite challenging for SMEs to integrate in with the universities. Now, Queen's have done a lot of work with regards to the knowledge transfer partnership, obviously number one in the UK, but we have got to find more ways for SMEs to find it easier, and that comes back to processes and bureaucracy as well, of how they integrate with the university.
You said a lot by what you didn't say there. Very interesting. Let's come to Suzanne and locate this for us in Belfast and the relationship between this institution and other higher educational institutions. Does Belfast, in terms of its governance, get that relationship, understand it?
It absolutely does. I was really concerned with your last comment about auctioning off Queen's, because if you do that, quite frankly, then our 20-year strategy that the Council has out for consultation at the minute, we're a bit stuffed, really, because...
Tell us a bit about that.
That 20-year strategy is all about growing the economy and all about ensuring that we do that in a very inclusive way, so that we make sure that all the citizens of this place are able to access the type of growth that we're going to create over that period of time. So, of course, an anchor institution like Queen's and the other higher and further education institutions are right at the heart of that, because actually, our agendas are absolutely aligned, mutually reinforcing in terms of what we're trying to achieve. If you think about what makes a successful place, a successful city, of course...
You're about to announce a major investment here, aren't you?
Well, maybe. But what makes a successful place is having a really vibrant, diverse, resilient economy. It is having a really vibrant culture. It is about being a great place to live. And Queen's has given people who live here a lot of confidence, and you can feel that in this city at this time. It is about having innovation and creativity right at the heart of the city. It's about having the right pipeline of skills for the jobs of the future, and leadership. Just to come back to leadership as a key issue. In this small region that we all inhabit, it should be easy to have joined up leadership and a joined up approach, and what we have been doing in terms of the city strategy and working with institutions like Queen's is that we now have joint management team meetings on a very regular basis to ensure that our strategies are absolutely aligned, and our Belfast agenda, the part that Queen's and other institutions play in that, in terms of they are absolutely at the heart of powering the economic future and providing and shaping our competitive advantage. So they're also driving, helping us to drive some regeneration in the city as well. I think the investment is upwards towards 300 million in terms from Queen's alone, in terms of new buildings in the city. Looking at how their students live here and the economic prosperity that they bring to the city and the vibrancy that they bring to the city, that's right at the heart of our strategy as well. And you saw £1 billion there on the screen of economic impact. They're also spending a lot as students and staff in the city as well, up to 400 million off campus too, and they're driving new student housing in the city, which is then going to lead to one of our big priorities. So in our Belfast agenda, we're saying we're going to create 50,000 new jobs over the next 20 years, based on the high growth sectors, some of which we've talked about and Joanne has talked about this evening. We're also going to grow the population in the city by 70,000. The fact that we're bringing in a lot more international students. Queens are part of that, the answer to that, because they're doubling their targets in terms of international students. If you look at other cities around the UK, if you look at Cardiff, for example, their population is growing year by year, and the attraction of the universities are absolutely part of that development. I just turn to some of the issues that you talked about briefly, about solving some of the problems that we have as well. So we talked about, helping us grow the economy, making the place successful, but we also have significant social issues that we have to solve in this place. And again, we have been working with the universities around the social inequalities, around research as to how we can best invest and create the best impact in solving some of those inequalities. We've also been looking at sustainable energy with the universities and early intervention work with when we know that we have particular social problems in the city. So, and they've been putting a lot of programs in place through their various schools to help the city solve those particular problems, and looking at how we can use technology, etc., to do that, and data analysis to do that.
Suzanne, can I just mention? I think that's the right way to go. But going back to my theme of challenges for us all, we've got two big challenges looming over all of us. It seems to me. On the one hand, there's the challenge of the Green Paper on industrial strategy, which the most unique thing about that strategy, to my mind, it was the first time a strategy had been designed in Whitehall that gave real pride of place to place.
Yes, I agree.
It's a place-based strategy for local innovation ecosystems. So places that can't craft those alliances between the university, between industry, between government and civil society, because it's a strategy not just for technology, but also for well-being. For example, for dementia, to create dementia-friendly places, for example. So that's one big challenge. How do we really craft those place-based strategies on the one hand? And then overarching everything is Brexit, the B word. And if it's not a benign deal, if it's a hard Brexit, it's going to create an enormous, unprecedented challenge for us all. And we're now beginning to realise the opportunity costs of Brexit, just in legislative terms, quite apart from financial terms. It's displacing a whole raft of other areas of bills for health, well-being, environment, whatever, will be obsessed with Brexit for the next Parliament, it seems to me. And that's a challenge for us all.
Do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, can I come back to the place-based strategy? Because absolutely in the UK industrial strategy, place features very strongly, and cities and city regions feature very strongly. And in fact, in England, you'll see the 10 core cities have already collaborated with their key universities to inform that policy, and that is not the case in our industrial strategy here. That is a real gap in our industrial strategy.
Our community minister chose not to be part of that city-based funding approach, right?
So I think you're talking about the city deal approach there. Cities are not really referenced in our Northern Ireland strategy, and what you're talking about in terms of place-based approaches is actually joining up everything that happens at a city level and providing the type of leadership that's needed to make sure that you grow the economy and solve the social problems at the same time. But in terms of city deals, that is certainly something that we haven't had the advantage of to date. Well, no, I'm still fighting for it, and maybe that's the investment that we'll be able to announce in the future, William. So, city deals. Cardiff just got their city deals signed off, I believe, by Theresa May this week. 1.2 billion pounds worth of a city deal. What that does, in simplistic terms, is that it devolves more flexibility and responsibility to the city governance arrangements, so they can invest in their infrastructure, invest in their skills, invest in research facilities, invest in spin-out innovation centres, etc. And that hasn't happened here yet. And that's something that, with the universities, we would be very keen to fight for.
Going to come to you in a second, right after this last question from me. Meric, when we talk to politicians here about, for example, investment of government money into, say, Game of Thrones, we're often told about the multiplier, this metric. For every pound that goes in of public money, 10 pounds comes back into our local economy, just in that one investment, Game of Thrones. Is there anything like that kind of metric or multiplier available for calculating the import of educational institutions?
Absolutely. One can make the analogy perfectly. So I mentioned $1 billion of £1 billion annually of impact from Queen's. The typical kinds of multipliers that one finds in the sector would be 3 or 4 times the initial investment coming back in terms of the indirect economic benefit and indirect economic activity. Is about 3 or 4 to 1 in terms of employment as well. So it's easy to point to very reputable studies that make that case very convincing.
Let's bring in our audience. Guys, all of you, please continue to join in with the conversation. I think someone had a question right at the back here. I'll get a second mic going as well and we'll move around. Over to you. Yep, go for it. Just give us your first name.
Hi, Richard from the Institution of Civil Engineers. Thanks very much to the panellists this evening. It's been very interesting. I'm interested just to pick up on the engagement point which John made, but also, Meric, you mentioned about having porous walls in the university. I'm interested as well to see the level of youth unemployment that we have here in Northern Ireland. I think it's around 25%. We also have an apprenticeship strategy. I'm just interested to hear your thoughts on how universities, if they're adopting apprenticeship strategies in other parts of the world, to try and bring industry, not just from a research point of view, but from an economic activity point of view, close to universities, to give our young people jobs that will build that infrastructure that underpins all this investment that we're talking about.
Thank you very much, Richard. Who want to pick up on that? Meric, do you want to have a go at that?
I'll start very briefly. There's a lot of demand for this in Canada right now, from both sides of the divide, both from employers and from students, interestingly. And it's, I think, the pressure that we are receiving from students in particular that is forcing a bit of an attitudinal shift, a much more deliberate opening. So we are actually working very closely now, both locally and nationally. There's something called the Business Higher Education Roundtable, which is a national table of business leaders and education leaders to explore how to dramatically expand the number of experiential learning opportunities for our students. And the goal is actually to create at least one opportunity for every post-secondary student in the country, no matter what field they are in. And that can be in a variety of forms. Apprenticeship is one of them. Internships, cooperative education, professional experience here, and more. So there's tremendous interest in this now and a lot of action. There's a pilot study that we're involved in Toronto, working with the financial services industry to create 10,000 new internship opportunities for students in that sector, drawn not just from management schools, but from engineering and computer science and sciences and mathematics and many other fields as well as, by the way, the arts. So it's really quite exciting to see what's happening.
Richard, do you want to grade that answer out of 10? Enough.
I'm totally happy with that. That's
you're
great.
delighted.
Thank you.
He's
Thank you.
absolutely delighted with the answer. Kevin.
Could I say, it's a fantastic question because it raises the issue of the real sleeping giant of regional policy, which is the untapped potential of public procurement. I was involved with a smart specialisation regional innovation programme in Europe recently, and Northern Ireland was one of our partners. And each region had the opportunity to choose a theme for innovation, and Northern Ireland chose public procurement, which I thought was bang on the money, because this is really an area where we're all struggling. But we have a new policy in Wales called 1 in a Million, that for every £1 million of public spend in our regional economy, we will be hiring an apprentice. And the universities now are under a lot of heat to justify their public procurement spend and what they're doing in terms of raising the stock of vocational and technical skills in the region, because in the past our sector has been really remiss about deploying its public spend to promote regional development. And suddenly the spotlight is on us, as it is on government, to show what we're doing for every pound from the public purse.
Anyone else? Just raise your hand. We'll get to you very quickly.
Could I just...
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Gentleman here first, and then we'll come to you. Someone over there. Oh, sorry, excuse me.
It's okay, I'll get the question. Well, I was just going to say, just to add to that point, because Meric mentioned Fintru in his presentation, and I think what that also showed was collaboration between further education and higher education, because that academy is Belfast Met as well. So there's, and I think you're starting to see more industry engaging on placements and higher level apprenticeships, but I think what we need to see is a bit more flexibility for how industry can engage with the higher education sector in defining what an apprenticeship may look like for them, or Earn As You Learn scheme, as it, for example, keynote would work very closely with the university in that. So I think there's other things can be done, and it's about increasing more flexibility in those models.
Jim Walsh from Maynooth University. I'm a geographer and spatial planner. Just picking up on the point that Kevin made about the internal challenges in universities in terms of getting more, changing the perception of academic staff about their roles and how they might contribute. But there is another side, of course, also, and it's how do we go about building the collaborations with the regions, from understanding the different cultures of workplace between the university and entities outside it. And also there are differences in expectations. Sometimes the expectations of regional stakeholders are not easily responded to by the academia. And likewise within the university there are expectations about being global players rather than being local and regional activists. So how do we reconcile those competing sets of ambitions?
I think we do it by having a well-defined understanding of our multiple identities. In Wales, we're pressured to engage in the city region in Wales. We're also a Russell Group institution, so we have global aspirations in terms of our rhetoric. And these are not mutually exclusive. We've got to do all these things. And I think Queen's is in the same position as we are in Cardiff. You have multiple identities. You need to be locally embedded and you need to be globally engaged. And these are not alternatives, but they are obligations on us because of our location and our history and our responsibility to the place in which we're rooted.
Let's go to Meric and then Linda on this.
Yeah. So it's a great question because it's one that I grapple with all the time. And the case I've made to people, and to me it's obvious because I'm a geographer and a planner, but the case I've made to people is, look, if your goal is world domination, and elevating your department or the University of Toronto to the very, very top tier of these rankings and so on, the strategy really depends on our success at home. That our success globally depends on our ability to work very well locally. And the point I make is this, and it's really one of enlightened self-interest, that the more we do as faculty, staff, and students to address the challenges in Toronto and help Toronto fulfill its opportunities and its potential, the more we're doing to help ourselves. Because the city is ultimately our best asset. It's what we use to attract and retain really talented people from across the country and around the world, whether they are faculty, staff, or students. So by helping the communities around us, we're actually helping ourselves. And people have really bought in.
Yeah, I think as well as that, it's just something that I've kind of noticed from a lot of the speakers here, is I think it's really important to highlight as well that the role the university can play in terms of implementing policies at a much broader level. And obviously my own discipline is planning, and I think the university has a huge role to play in terms of plan implementation, but also I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that, and I think again it has been mentioned that it's not a quick fix. We need to be cognizant of the different sectors of the economy, and particularly, for instance, in Dublin, there was attempts to set up research institutes to stimulate the digital economy, and they only lasted 4 or 5 years. So I think we need to be quite cognizant of the local conditions, the local sectoral needs as well, instead of kind of having a universal approach. Kind of having a tailored approach as well, I think, is really important.
Bjorn.
So it's a very important question, and there's some sort of precondition, you know. So you need to have, of course, excellent research, but the research need to be relevant also in a medium, at least a medium-term perspective, and you need to have an industry that have a sort of capacity that knows to be globally competitive in advanced or high-tech sectors, you know. You need this research-based knowledge. And then you can return to one of my remarks in the beginning. You can achieve this sort of if you have some sort of incentives through this organizational and institutional innovation. Let me use a short Swedish example. Swedish innovation policy, which is sort of run by a public agency called Vinnova, a Swedish for innovation system. They have a sort of a triple helix perspective on their regional innovation policy. So they say, we want to build a strong research and innovation milieux in a 10 years perspective. We provide 50% of the funding. The rest, the regional stakeholders should provide. This is a lot of money even for big Swedish industry, a lot of money for universities. If you don't find a way to collaborate and have plans that are good enough, you don't get it. So this is a hardcore sort of money as incentives, you know, to achieve things. And it's Swedish possible. Triple Helix works very, very nicely because of this.
Let's go to our next question.
One quick comment and then a question. I was very taken with Kevin mentioning about procurement, and one of the things possibly worth mentioning in relation with the city is, of course, I mean, Belfast is actually running some highly innovative procurement work at the moment on maximising rates revenue for the city, and interestingly, one of the companies working on it is a Queen spin-out. So you can see even from that there's actually a connection between the research base and strengths in data analytics, but also actually delivering better public services and innovating in procurement. So they are doing it. I think that has to be significant credit to the City Council. One question, I was very taken with the maps that Meric showed in terms of research partnerships internationally, and also quite a lot of talk around foreign direct investment coming into the city. And I'm from the Department for Economy, so yes, we welcome both of those things hugely, and yes, universities are investment. One question though, is it possible that we could or should be doing more with those research connections on connecting our SMEs and our micro businesses to international markets? Because if we are looking at Brexit, and we hope it's a soft one, but either way, we're going to have more of our companies collaborating internationally. So where we have international students coming in, how do we piggyback on that to get our companies coming out to export and to form those research partnerships outside the region as well?
Yeah, terrific question, and I wish I had a ready answer for you, but I don't, because we're finding it very difficult too. Let me just back up and say I agree with you, though, that it's an important objective, and moreover, given the maps that you saw, universities are indeed ideally situated to introduce local firms, large and small, to potential partners elsewhere around the world. In other words, to work their own networks, which are research-based, for the advantage of local enterprise. One of the things that we're doing is that when we go around the world now and talk to other institutions about forging partnerships, we're asking them to tell us about the kind of local partnerships they have with the private sector, because that, to us, is one of the qualities that we're increasingly interested in developing, so that, you know, we would partner with University A or University B in a particular city, not just because of the quality of the research that's being done and the reputation of the institution, but also because of the connections they have to really interesting partners locally. So, you know, it I think points to the need for us to rethink the way that we build partnerships globally and the kind of rationale or motivation for it.
All right, Kevin, then Cecilia.
I'm sorry to mention Brexit again, but you know, in the context of Brexit, I think there's going to be a huge imperative on us all to think about how we design smarter policies to support our SMEs, particularly micros, to engage not just in exports but in networks abroad. And we often say to our master's students, the problem with a small firm isn't that it's small, it's that it's lonely. And a small scale needn't be a hindrance if it's networked and working in concert with others. And we need to design smarter policies to allow firms to move abroad together. This was one of the secrets. Meric and I, many years ago, used to study the Mittelstand sector in Germany. And when they moved abroad, they moved in concert. And this is one of the great strengths of being small but moving abroad together, so getting ahead together. And I think we need to draw on good examples of small firm economies to see how they can export, because Brexit is going to have a punishing effect on our policy, particularly after 2020, when all bets are off.
We get that you're not with UKIP, by the way. We understand that. Suzanne?
I think that internationalisation is absolutely critical now, and I think we're all turning our minds to how we internationalise, but we have to do that collectively as a city. And just to come back to the issue about how we support our small businesses as well. So we have Belfast City Council out making relationships internationally. We have Queen's, we have Ulster out making international relationships. We have Invest NI as well. What we're trying to do is join up our whole approach to that and make sure that our small business community, that we are actually creating not only the networks for us to do that institutionally, but also for our small businesses. I think that Dublin have a very good example of how they have done that. They have created a small business commissioner, and her whole purpose in life is to create the ecosystems and the networks, both locally and internationally, both with the small businesses and with big business as well. Just to come back to the point that you made about the procurement issue, I think that is a perfect example, the one that you used, as to how we can collaborate and create an ecosystem for innovation. So what we have done there is working with universities and the business sector. We looked at a problem that we needed to be solved, and we have a long list of these city problems that we need solving. That particular problem was we want to see how we can maximise our rates income into the council, so we can make sure we can do more invest it back into the economy and communities. And we asked the small businesses, the tech small businesses, to come up with solutions and gave them a certain amount of money to prototype those solutions. They then can go, and once they can show that those work, they can then scale those up, and we will help them to sell those solutions worldwide.
Thanks very much. To our next question. Yes.
Sorry, I was too busy writing there. That was very insightful, Sam. Thanks very much. Just a wee question to Meric and also the rest of the panel. I'm very impressed with the two maps that come up, but a lot of the global connections seem to be with the high tech and medical sciences and engineering. I'm just wondering, in the creative field, what the connections exist in Toronto in relation to joining forces with creative outlets and other universities throughout the world.
So when you say creative field, can you elaborate a little bit more on what sort of...
As in the visual arts rather than the...
So, you know, my sense is there's an awful lot of visual artists are amongst the most globalized individuals that I know. They seem to have amazingly global networks of collaboration and co-publication for those who publish, and certainly collaboration in terms of the realization of artistic projects. So they are very much part and parcel of these kinds of global networks. And the same is true across the humanities, where, in fields like medieval studies, for example, our folks in our Center for Medieval Studies do an awful lot of collaborative work with great scholars around the world.
Thank you very much. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. We're in the quick fire round now, so let's head for sound bites if we can. Go for it.
I'm Elby Byrne. I'm a graduate of Queen's who emigrated to the Maiden City 42 years ago, and it has been totally neglected in those 40 years. And I'm just wondering, how will Derry fit in if all this money's coming into Belfast? There's only a very small pot.
Yeah.
It's a small region, and Derry deserves its share.
I'm happy to answer that.
Because Derry does have McGee College. It's important in the economy of Derry, very important in the cultural life of Derry too.
Absolutely, it is. When I am talking about Belfast being the economic driver of the region, it's not about Belfast alone. Absolutely not. And it is about how we work with the other cities as well. And obviously Derry being the second city, incredibly important. For example, one of the things that we're doing collectively with Derry is putting in a bid for European Capital of Culture 2023 as a joint two-city bid. So that collaborative working is happening all the time. And in terms of infrastructure investment, you'll see in the draft industrial strategy that it relates to both cities.
I talked earlier on about sort of world-class research institutes, and one of the announcements recently was the Cognitive Analytics Research Laboratory, which has been announced by Ulster University. But that's integrating with industry there in Derry. So you've got the likes of Seagate and Fujitsu and Allstake and Primerica from actually in Donegal. And what's really key in that is you're starting to see this move to open innovation as well, where they're seeing the areas that they need to research on, but they're prepared to work together and work with the university. And I think what we need to see is then how do we collaborate in that, so that we've got the ESIT and CSIT in Belfast, we've got Carl, it's called, in Derry, but how do we make sure that we're getting the experiences from both universities in both as well, and it's how that piece collaborates as well.
The vision of a university that has been presented is really compelling in the way it aligns state, educational and commercial interests. And what I'd like to ask the panel is, does anybody lose in that model?
The model is often called the triple helix, isn't it? University, business, government working together. But it's a triumph of rhetoric over reality in my experience. Most regions, most cities don't even have a double helix, let alone a triple helix. So a triple helix is a good aspiration, and if you can make it work, and in Sweden there's good evidence that they've made it work. But it seems to me it's more aspirational than actuality. But where it does work, I believe, I'm thinking from my own work as an engagement dean, that you can have some positive spillovers for teaching, research, and engagement, or knowledge exchange, if you craft it right, because students increasingly want some experience of work. They want to work on projects, whether it's in the third sector or in private sector or public sector. They want that experience, and universities are increasingly trying to meld together these three domains of teaching, research, and engagement, rather than them being separate circles, separate domains. The holy grail in our sector is trying to create these overlapping circles. And if you can do that, and it's easier said than done, of course, you can make it can be a win-win for all concerned. But there are dangers if you go down the route too heavily in terms of commercialization. It can displace other forms of engagement on the social and cultural and art side. So there are dangers, but there are big opportunities if you can get it right, in my experience.
Thanks, Kevin.
Hello, my name is Chamindra Veeravardhana, and I am a research fellow here at Queen's, and I also have very, very good connections in Canada. I'm organising a panel at Ryerson in Toronto shortly in May. The question I wanted to raise was, the panel, I mean, all the panel members are talking about international partnerships and innovation and so on. And the professor from Cardiff rightly noted this whole issue of Brexit. I just wanted to kind of push that a bit further. But what I wanted to say was, in terms of international innovation, like a progressive academic lobbies, you have this discourse of moving forward, but at the same time you have in policy-making circles, governmental circles, increased barriers for people, to especially from the global souths, to develop partnerships. And I've come across many people. I couldn't count, with the fingers of two hands the number of people I've come across from the global souths who have had trouble perfectly qualified individuals, firms with great potential to come over to this part of the world and develop partnerships. And this, to a certain extent, this is present to a lesser extent in Canada, but Canada is not totally immune to this issue as well. So in terms of those issues of a world that is kind of closing up around itself. So, what would be your perspectives on challenging those conservatisms as such?
Thank you very much. I'm not going to Kevin on this. Anybody else who's not Kevin want to comment on this?
I'm happy to start.
Pushing back against those kind of exclusionary dynamics.
So, you really pick up on the tension I was trying to reflect on in my talk. Because I agree with you. I do think we see a kind of closing in, which is ultimately not a good thing. I mean, I'll put my heart on my sleeve. I really don't think it's a good thing. So this is why I think that research universities that have this capacity to connect globally are a progressive force in the opposite direction. That's really the point I was trying to make, that we need to think of them even more now, because of what's happening in places like this, as forces that can transcend and push against that sort of tendency to refocus inward, that they have, by their nature, a kind of tendency to collaborate across international boundaries and to build networks. So, all the more reason for leaders of institutions like this one and like the one that I happen to lead to do everything they can to help open doors both for their faculty and students to connect with colleagues abroad, but also to welcome talent and partners from a wide array of international locations.
Bjorn. So could I answer this question from sort of more the principled perspective? We talk about innovation understood as interactive learning. So the more partners you can interact with, potentially, the more innovative you can be. Secondly, that diversity in all type of contexts, diversity is a positive thing. I mean, you become more innovative. Firms that employ a diverse labor force, they open up new export market. So this is potentially extremely beneficial. Thirdly, of course, it's an interesting tendency that Annelies Saxenian pointed out, that more and more have brine circulation. So it's not this one-way thing. So you come from Sri Lanka, India, whatever, and then you go to the United States or Britain or whatever, and then you stay there. There's a tendency of this brine circulation, and then then you get rid of this exploitation perspective, that used to be before. Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of evidence, hard evidence, that sort of tells you that this sort of global free flow of people really increases the capacity to be innovative. Potentially, both in the receiver country and the country that is sending or they're traveling from.
Bjorn, every 10th word in the referendum debate about Brexit was the word Norway.
You say, sorry?
Every 10th word was the word Norway. We all know a lot about Norway now. Yeah. You're not in the European Union, obviously. How is that affecting the network of relationships that you want to encourage in terms of these relationships?
So Norway has a sort of special situation that Britain doesn't want to go into. We are part of single market. We accept free flow of people and everything. But we have no influence. For Norway, it doesn't really matter. But Norway is a small country, so we couldn't have any influence anyway. For Britain, of course, you had a big influence in the EU. So that's a different thing. So
you're provoking Kevin again. I'm sorry.
So for Norway, of course, this has been extremely beneficial. Norway has a small, open economy, extremely dependent on selling to the world, and also depending on importing knowledge and people, because a small country has a limited capacity of producing talented people and ideas. So Norway is extremely depending on being open and to benefit from this sort of free flow of everything,
But the analogy is misplaced. Sorry, the analogy with Norway is really misplaced. Nobody can afford to live in Norway, so nobody goes there. So that's one of the differences.
But I think it's one of the things that did surprise me was when you put it up that the perception is that the UK is closing itself, and that for me, what Brexit and what certainly those that are taking us forward on Brexit this is about us being a much more open economy. This is about us creating better and stronger relationships across the whole of the world. But I think there is, and it came out in the referendum, there is a fear in wider society that I don't think we have communicated the positive impact of people from other countries coming in to the UK, and all we hear are the negatives, or the perceived negative side of that. And I think it's where the university has a key role to play in showing, the diversity of people that are coming in, the positive impact that they're having, not just within the university but in wider. And we have to continue to make sure that message gets out, because that's what for me is creating this fortress Britain.
Free movement of knowledge.
Just a small remark, Mark, following up Meric's sort of final word of the thought experiment. Think about all this sort of clever people populating British universities from, let's say, from Europe, for instance. If they suddenly disappeared, what would happen?
More jobs for us, Bjorn. All right, two final questions. Gentlemen here, and I'll come to you, Fred. You've been very patient.
I'm Mukul Shukla. I joined last week the School of Mechanical Engineering and Aerospace from India. The question is taken from the gentleman who started the proceedings, as well as a follow-up of this lady. We were talking of getting more international students around. But over the last week I have spoken, and there were like a lot of Brazilian students, Malaysian students. So there's a shift around, and one of the reasons possibly is this fortress type of a thing. So on one side you want to attract more and more international students. However, if you don't, say, open the visa laws, or giving them then the opportunity of working in an industry, maybe in the form of an internship. So how do you think this model would be sustainable? Possibly even Patrick could answer this.
Well done. Not just the Vice-Chancellor into an answer. Go ahead, Patrick.
Well, I think it's first of all, a wonderful question, and it's very, very timely. The UK is in real trouble in terms of attracting international students, directly related to the policies of the Home Office under Theresa May, particularly around Tier 4 type legislation. We have lost our status in India as the #1 country in the world to which Indian students came over the last 6 years. We're now #4. So the US and Australia now outdo us very significantly. And I do think we have to be very careful, because as some of the panel have already alluded to, mixed up with Brexit, there is a much wider international perception that not just in Europe, but worldwide, we have pulled up the drawbridge and that we're not welcoming anymore. And so we've now seen that nationally, 8% drop in EU students applying to British universities this year. We will see in September what the impact of that is. But that trend is likely to continue. And unless we actually then open up to international countries beyond the EU, such as India, in a way that allows students to come, possibly do an internship and then go back, we are going to be in serious trouble as UK higher education institutions.
Yes.
Thank you very much. This is going to be our final question. Fred, no pressure. Make it a good one.
I'm asking this question as someone who taught at Queen's here for about 30 years and had the pleasure of having 1 year at the U of T as well, so I've been there. We've heard quite a lot about the University of Toronto, and we've heard quite a lot about Queen's, but both cities are multi-university cities. At least Belfast has 2, and I know Toronto has at least 3. I just wonder... 4? Four. Yeah. I just wonder to what extent it's important in all of this that there should be cooperation between the 2 or the 3 or the 4 universities in the city in this sort of regional enterprise, or is just a sort of healthy competition is all that we need? Do we want to stimulate a bit more, rather than thinking of them as rivals up the road, but as actually collaborators in a joint enterprise?
That's a wonderful question. So, you know, I would answer by saying that it's true. There are 4 universities in Toronto, just in the city of Toronto proper, and more nearby. And for years, we really did not do much to play well together. In fact, we had our elbows up most of the time. But I made the same pitch when I became president. I made the same pitch to the presidents of the other 3 universities in the city as I made to our faculty and staff, which is, you know, the more we do collectively to address Toronto's challenges or to make Toronto a better place, the more we help ourselves. And moreover, we can probably make more progress more quickly by collaborating. So yes, we compete on many levels, but there are platforms on which I think it makes sense for us to cooperate. And what we've done is to focus on those issues that affect all of us equally. The first thing that we worked on together was the daily transportation challenges that our students face to get to and from our campuses. All of us are big commuter schools. We have a lot of students who come to our campuses every day, and they experience challenges because of the systemic and long-term underinvestment in public transit in the city. So we pooled together some funds to support a joint research project involving faculty and students at all 4 of the universities to conduct the first ever comprehensive survey of daily travel patterns of students. And between the 4 of us, we enroll 180,000 students, right? So that's a huge population. We now have a fabulous database, the first time ever that anyone has collected this kind of data, at least in Toronto and possibly Canada and beyond. And we're working with the city government, the Toronto Transportation Commission, Metrolinx, which is a regional transportation agency, the city planning department, to make this data available so that it can better inform transit and transportation investment decisions. Next up on the list was collaboration on welcoming and settling Syrian refugees. So the 4 universities got together to pool resources and know-how to welcome refugees to Toronto. And as you may know, Canada brought in something in excess of 40,000 Syrian refugees, many of them to Toronto. The third topic that we're working on is affordable housing for students. And again, we're going to be working in the same collaborative way that we did on the transportation study. And there are no end of actually great topics that we can actually collaborate on, and in doing so really move the needle.
Quite a few universities in America have joint degree programs. Do you have any joint degree degrees?
We have a couple with York University in fields like ancient history and philosophy. So there's potential for that to proceed. But I would suggest that that's probably easier to do with non-local partners than it is with local partners. As well, we could talk about the reasons why afterwards. And my goal is to really focus on those areas of cooperation where it's easy to get partners to say yes rather than the opposite.
Meric, this has been great. If you could just end by giving a bit of advice, first to this university or all the academic institutions here, and also to the city and the government in terms of what they can do, 1 or 2 things they can do to move the kinds of positive relationships on that you've been describing.
Sure. Well, you know, I guess the leitmotif of my talk has been, first of all, for civic leaders and citizens of Belfast to appreciate what a tremendous asset they have in their midst in terms of the strength of the higher education and research sector that's here, Queen's being the leading exponent or leading example, but not the only one. And I hope that I've been able to broaden people's understandings of the way in which institutions like Queen's create value and opportunity for this kind of place. To the university, actually I have very little to say because they're doing all the things that I'm doing in Toronto. Patty and I talked earlier about how we're each trying to kind of reposition our institutions in the minds and the imaginations of local citizenry and government leaders so that they recognize us as willing and enthusiastic city building organizations.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all of our panel for joining the conversation tonight. A very big thank you to the 2017 Eaton Lecturer. Let's thank Meric Gertler.